Okay, let's talk about building reports in RMarkdown. So we've been using RMarkdown this whole class, but we've really only been using kind of a small portion of what we can do with it. It turns out RMarkdown is super powerful and can create really beautiful reports that can be really useful depending on the setting that you're in. And so we're going to talk about kind of some ways to customize your reports that you've been building so far and kind of building on that. So, harnessing the power of RMarkdown. This is kind of the agenda of what we're going to go through today. First, we're going to talk about code chunk options, which have come up occasionally in class, but I'm going to show you some more advanced settings there. Then we're going to talk about how to make some nice tables using R. And then how to use inline code, which I think some of you have been doing in lab, and so we're going to go into that a little bit more detail. And then how to actually output in different formats. And so for this class so far, we've always output as an HTML document, but it turns out that other options are possible as well. So code chunks. So all code chunks options that you might want can be found on this website here that I have linked to. If you go to the slides, the actual HTML files for the slides, which can be found on our class website, this is a clickable link, so you can see kind of all of those that are available. But a couple that we'll talk about. So the code chunk options, they go in this little top of your code chunk after the R. So for example, like this one, echo equals false. This code chunk is going to suppress the R code. So you'll notice I have my same kind of start to my R chunk, but then I have a comma here, and then I've got this option echo equals false. And so what that will do when I knit my document is the code will still run that's in that chunk, but you won't actually see the code. So you know how now when you knit your document, you see the chunk of code that you wrote, and then you see the output from that code, and then you see any text that you've written in between. And so with this, this will make it so that you don't see the code, you just see the output. Another option here is eval equals false. And what that will do, if used by itself, that will just make that code chunk not be evaluated. So it won't actually run the code in that chunk. It'll still print it unless you also include echo equals false. So you'll still see the code in your output, but it won't actually run anything. So this can be helpful if you're just trying to demonstrate how to do some kind of pseudocode or something like that, but not actually run it. And then here, this example is one that several of you I think have started to incorporate. But when you include certain packages at the top of your RMarkdown file, if there are warnings or messages that come with those packages, it can sort of clutter up your document. And so if you add this message equals false and warning equals false, that will suppress those messages when you knit your document. And so notice how you can append multiple chunk options here by just separating them by a comma. So you could add in the echo equals false as well if you didn't want that chunk to be shown. And then finally, here's one for figure captions. And so this is a really good one. You can use fig.cap to include captions in it for your figures. So if your R chunk includes just the one figure, if you add fig.cap, it'll and you put a caption here, it'll caption that figure for you. So that will look nice in your final report. So for fancy reports, we often want to see our code, but we don't really want it interspersed throughout the document. So for the lab so far, of course, because half of what I'm checking there is your actual R code, and then of course I'm also checking kind of your explanations, it was nice to have the code kind of interspersed along with the explanations. But sometimes when you're handing a report to someone that may or may not be interested in the code, it can be helpful to maybe not show it as immediately, maybe put it at the end of the document. And so that's what this will do. You can actually hide all of your chunks by adding this to the top of your .rmd file. If you load the knitter package, which that's actually the package that's being used when you click that little blue knit button on the top. So if you load that package in your very top chunk, and notice I'm setting echo equals false for this chunk so that when I knit my document, you won't see this code. And then you add this opt_chunks $set echo equals false. And so what that's doing is it's setting the chunk options for every single subsequent chunk to be echo equals false. So instead of having to write this in all of the subsequent chunks, you're basically doing a shortcut where you're writing it here. So what that's going to do is it suppresses the printing of all of the chunks that you'll have that run after this chunk here. So that's going to make all of those chunks get hidden. And then we want one more step. At the end of your document, for example, in an appendix, you can add this code exactly like this, where you say you do r ref.label equals knitter, and then these two little colons. What that does is it's saying we're using the all_labels function, which comes from the knitter package. So I'm going to use this all_labels function. And now I'm going to set echo equals true, but eval equals false. And why am I doing that? Well, I'm doing that because what I want to see now is I want all of this code to print, so I want echo equals true, but I don't want to actually evaluate it a second time. I don't want to run that code. I just want to print it. So what this will do, this little chunk here, if you stick this at the end of your document, is it will run everything it will print everything that you've typed there in your previous chunks. So I'm going to demo some of this for you now. Let's do a quick demo where we show some of these different things in practice. So for example, here if I had a load packages chunk, I'm going to set message equals false. Well, first let's do it without setting message equals false and warning equals false. So I'm going to load the tidyverse package. When I knit that document, this is what I get. So I see library tidyverse, and then I see all of these messages. And so now I'm going to add in the message equals false and warning equals false. And now I'm going to knit it again, and let's see what happens now. See, now it suppresses those messages, so I just see the library tidyverse. And now I'm going to demonstrate that neat trick I showed where we can print all the code at the end. So I'm not going to print this chunk. I'm going to load the knitter package. And now I'm going to do ops chunk set echo equals false. So let's try to just run that and see what happens. So now nothing is getting output because all I have right now are two chunks, one that loads the tidyverse package and one that says I don't want any of my chunks to be printed. And so because there's no code being run, we're not going to see anything. So let's add some code that actually, let's have some code that is a figure, for example. So this is going to be a plot. I'm going to call this fig. Let's do ggplot. Let's use the MT cars data. And we're going to plot weight by miles per gallon. And do geom point. So let's see what that looks like. So I see my plot, but you'll notice my code was suppressed even though I didn't tell it needed to be, because up here I said that I wanted all of the subsequent code to have echo equals false. All right, now let's add a caption to this figure. So I'm going to use fig.cap, and I'm going to say, this is going to say, looking at the relationship between weight and miles per gallon using the MT cars data set. So I used fig.cap as my chunk option, and then I put the caption I wanted to see in quotation marks. So now let's run that, and there you have it. You can see it right there. There's my caption. So now the last part is, let's say I want down in an appendix, I want to actually print all my code. And so I'm going to call this appendix, or maybe I could call it code appendix. So I'm going to make a section here, the double hashtag that is going to, or the double pound sign, that's going to make a section. And now I'm going to say, if we remember from our code, we say ref.label knitter all labels, echo equals true, eval equals false. So ref.label equals knitterall labels, echo equals true, eval equals false. So what that's going to do is it's going to show all of my code, but it's not going to reevaluate it a second time. So I won't end up with a second plot. I'll just end up with the code. So now in my code appendix, it prints all of the code that we did. Now if I got rid of this echo or eval equals false, what do you think would happen? It's actually going to run that code twice. So you'll see that there's a second plot that gets created, which is not really what we want. So I'm going to put that back in, eval equals false. Okay, so that shows how we've cleaned up our document a bit to basically have a plot, and then we've got our code appendix that includes all of the code output at the end of our document. Our plot has a nice caption. So I think let's move on from here and you can try it yourself. So what I want you to do is I want you to choose one of the analyses from the last lab that you did, and I want you to copy the analysis that you did, so where you sort of looked at your model and you checked your assumptions, that whole analysis, I want you to copy all of that into a new RMarkdown file. And then I want you to edit the chunks so that there are no warnings or messages that are printed. I want all of the figures that you have to have appropriate captions, and I want all the code to be printed only at the end of the document. So instead of having the code interspersed, I want it to all be at the end. Let's go ahead and work on that.